Greetings, Orcs Nest t-shirt fans. It's been quite some time. I've gotten a haircut since we last spoke. Anyway, I wanted to talk about Weird World War II. And I wanted to do this in part because we have a new subscriber, or a new couple of subscribers, a new couple who have a YouTube channel, which deals with Weird World War II. And I've also talked about, prior to them subscribing and communicating, the most recent My Rules Are Better, which is a bonus episode. I'm not sure what its name is. Apologies. Anyway, that contained also some discussion associated with Weird World War II. And I think it's a really interesting topic because the question is, how far are you willing to go with your Weird World War II? Now, for me, the Second World War is just... There are looters out there, ladies and gentlemen. Anyway, for me, the Second World War is just a sacred period. I read a lot about the Second World War. I read a lot of soldier accounts. I read a lot of broader histories. Currently reading Operation Paperclip. I just read a lot of stuff associated with the Second World War, and it's a period of time that I feel an immense sense of, this is great irony, an immense sense of peace in the understanding of the various components. Now, I see World War II as just a series of tragedies, kind of layered on top, far greater than anything that Shakespeare could ever possibly imagine. Certainly, I heard about Hugh Trevor Roper's account of Hitler just being an actor, and I wasn't really sympathetic to that until I'd read Hugh Trevor Roper's account of Hitler just being an actor. And I think it's really very curious looking at this conflict with this idea of good and evil. Because really what you have is evil, 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 more convoluted evil, and then just the tragedy of humanity and various areas associated with this thing. And yeah, it's interesting to think about just bombing cities. The Allies bombed a lot of cities. Now that clearly the Axis did a lot of horrible things as well, and a lot of bombing of cities too. But you know, the interesting kind of narratives and counter-narratives of the various sides and the various historical perspectives, it's such a rich, it's such a rich environment to read about and to understand. And it's curious, the things that I learned through reading about the Second World War just seem limitless. I learn new bits and pieces the more that I read about it. And intellectually, I just find it so sustaining. And when I was a small boy, I didn't spend a lot of time with my father, but the times that I did spend with my father were going around this place called the Australian War Memorial, which unfortunately is no longer the way it once was. It used to be a huge history museum with lots of mannequins and in uniforms and guns and tanks and planes and all this kind of stuff. And it's now super sterile, iPads, movies. I mean, I do understand that these things deteriorate rapidly over time, particularly when they're exposed to, the general public air and this kind of stuff. But anyway, it changed dramatically so the Contemporary War Memorial in Australia, I mean, it is still a large history museum. It just doesn't quite have the quantity of stuff that it had when I was a boy. And when I was last there, they had to put the Holocaust down onto a single cue card. So there are issues of nationalism and really very curious Australian-specific stuff with War Memorial. Moving on from that, I spent a vast quantity of time with my father in the War Memorial, and in later life, I realised that he had also read William L. Shirer, Hugh Trevor Roper, a lot of the authors of the period that I know and have read. He also read as well, but 40 plus years before my reading of it. It's interesting actually because he'll ask me questions about the Second World War when it's still very, in the forefront of my mind, where I realize that for him it's just something that historically he read. But, Nuremberg, the many Nuremberg trials, all these things just completely have just permeated my psyche. So the Second World War, I think, has some elements that can be explored in kind of weird World War II or what-if scenarios. But when it's werewolves and walking tanks and these kind of things, I'm just not there. So that's one of the walls associated with Weird World War II. The other wall is associated with really poor writing. So I'm fascinated by Operation Sea Lion. And I'm fascinated by the lack of scholarship and lack of quality of analysis associated with Operation Sea Lion. So, one of the first books, I've had others, but I've given away a lot of books. This is 6 pages of this is on Operation Sea Lion. I wouldn't rate any of these books, and I'll talk a little bit more. This book, which was recommended by a YouTuber, so this book references this book. This book is just really curious. The conclusion of it is kind of maps and towns, just pages and pages and pages of maps. So it's kind of like an atlas of, the UK at the time, photos of the UK, the signal to noise ratio, or let's say signal to noise ratio, is unbelievably low in this book. There's a huge amount of noise and not a lot of signal. So let's also talk about this as well, which is a rule set based around Operation Sea Lion. I think, and understandably so, Operation Sea Lion is a really touchy subject. Like, it's an aspect of the potential of what could have happened in the Second World War that I think certainly in general the British public and even British gamers don't really want to explore. When I reflect on Sea Lion, I think of it in the terms of the scale of Barbarossa. Basically, if Sea Lion had happened, I would think it would have happened at the scale maybe. So Barbarossa is like 3.8 million soldiers, Germans, across. So I think Sea Lion would have been in that order, maybe leaving 800,000 with a view that the Soviets weren't really going anywhere. And probably an invasion force of at least 3 million. None of these books talk about that. They all have this. I mean, look, if you were going to believe anything, don't believe some. I mean, it's a bit like Speer, right? Speer is such a classic, like double-crossing kind of war criminal like dude. Von Braun as well. I've got a lot of less than positive things to say about a number of these folks associated with Paperclip and also Speer, which are fundamentally, I mean, in terms of creating the infrastructure in some part. Roller Goering was there as well, but a number of folks involved with these things. But why believe what the Nazis produce? Like, why use this as a source book? It's paper thin. And really, it's just offensive to think that this was in any way, like, this is the stooge document that you leave for the British and say, yeah, this is what we were going to do. So yeah, using this as a source, I think, is really very poor. I would look at the size of Barbarossa and the intelligence with a view that what was going to be used for Sea Lion was moved to Barbarossa, right? So if you think of Sea Lion being 3 million, Wehrmacht SS, crossing the channel, flying over, dropping in, the knife edge associated with the Royal Air Force and the Luftwaffe that would have enabled Sea Lion to happen. What would the losses have been like initially? Well, you have the reverse invasion at D-Day, right? But Sea Lion was even less protected than the fortifications at D-Day that the Allies encountered. And what you're relying on is a series of villages, basically, and then larger, cities as they made their way to London. You've got to imagine that this thing would have been completely and utterly unlike anything that is offered in these accounts. I mean, even this thing, which is normally a game about, this notion that Dad's army would have had anything to do with, the Wehrmacht coming across, the Waffen-SS coming across. This would have been brutal, and it would have probably resulted in really substantial losses, primarily on the British side. And to take into account what this would have looked like, I don't think modern authors can really, explain that gravity. And I think that the people that use the single flimsy thing as a means of, describing what it would have looked like, I don't know, it just doesn't seem like, Hitler wouldn't have made a half-assed effort if he was going to do something. You'd want to get there and win. And the fact that they didn't do it indicates really strongly that, But if you look at what happened with Barbarossa, I mean, that would have gone up to, Manchester, Leeds, Edinburgh. That force would have hit England and just flattened it. So my perspective on Weird World War II is Sea Lion is an interesting one. But I would play Sea Lion with Dad's Army versus three-quarters of the Wehrmacht just coming at you. With the view that, I mean, the channel would have been difficult. The channel crossing would have been difficult. The RAF would have inflicted good numbers of casualties, but it wouldn't have halved the number. It wouldn't have quartered the number or three-quartered the number. You might have lost 10 to 15% in the crossing. But the force, the strike force, which these rules just, I mean, these rules are just shockingly poor. Anyway, so that's part of Weird World War II for me. I think certainly Sea Lion is right, but a more aggressive Sea Lion than is accounted for in any of the writing. I think the Sea Lion that's accounted for is kind of Dad's Army, Gentleman's War, kind of. No, it would have been really brutal. Well, it's interesting actually because the political part of Barbarossa created a lot of the brutality, and you wouldn't have had that political brutality with regards to Sea Lion. But it's still an interesting, it's an interesting mind state to work through what one would think Sea Lion would look like if it was a serious move, not a experiment, not dipping the toe in the water, so to speak, but a serious invasion. So yeah, Sea Lion, fascinating. There's so much potential with regards to partisans, particularly on the Eastern Front. I think the nuances with partisans. I have a DVD that was just released from I think it's Ukrainian or it's Belarusian, called what is it? Hear me, come see me, look now, something like that. Anyway, I saw it only a few months ago. Absolutely fascinating film. You see various excerpts of it on YouTube. None of them do it justice. Pay for the DVD costs to see it. I guess I could look it up on my phone. But anyway, I'll leave it in the notes. And that, to me, defines a perspective of the partisans, which I think is really fascinating. I should have some partisan books as well. Because I think that is an area of weird or potential World War II, which really could be played very interestingly. I think just within the kind of espionage, counter-espionage within the Third Reich, within all the powers that participated, I think there's a great possibility of, possible World War II scenarios. The spying on the Americans was just done so incredibly poorly that a possibility of that to be straight. Or what happens if Hitler had the bomb, which is Man in the High Castle? I mean, Hitler didn't, thankfully. Well, that was stuck in Semitic brains that were across the Atlantic, or got out when they had a chance to. But yeah, if Hitler had the bomb, that is another interesting scenario. Although less, a different kind of macro gameplay, I guess. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff in the Second World War that I think is ripe for interest, and even speculative battles, which I think honestly seems to be what the weird World War II couple are doing, speculative battles. But yeah, it is interesting because there are certain things that I just can't abide by in the Second World War. It's one of these curious things, which is why I thought this is an interesting topic for a video. I should really do a video about this thing, about what this thing's about. But yeah, I just find the Second World War so fascinating and so much learning and such a rich example of the sheer follies of humanity and idealism and counter-idealism and just the brutality of idealism fundamentally. And yeah, just such a humanity sigh, really. That's the raw emotion from it. So I feel very particular about what World War II I invest my time in. But it is an interesting topic, and I see, certainly, the nature of bolt action, these things, is all speculative. You can play actual battles, I guess, through bolt action, but it's not a simulation set, it's a war game, right? It's not a simulation. So, Anyway, Monty here in the Bay Area, post-COVID-19 haircut. Well, not post-COVID-19, but haircut. Anyway, the haircut's done. And I hope to record more videos, and thank you for humouring me this evening.